That's why the grass grows taller there. That's why no one can sleep soundly within the valley. That's why when the stars freeze overhead and the sky forgets to move, you can hear the faint sound of feet moving in time with a drum that hasn't stopped in 134 years. The old stories say the earth remembers balance. Every wound, every lie, every song cut short, it all echoes back one way or another. Some places echo louder. And so the story of the wounded plains does not end in silence. It ends with the earth itself speaking, with the air trembling, with the people still standing. At dawn, the fires go out. The valley glows faintly with frost. The people rise and leave in single file the way their ancestors once danced in circles, never lines. Behind them, the snow falls gently, covering their footprints one by one. If you arrive after they've gone, you'll see nothing extraordinary. Just snow, just grass, just an ordinary patch of earth under an unmoving sky. But if you close your eyes, really close them, you'll feel something shift under your feet. A pulse, a vibration, a slow, rhythmic breath that has waited more than a century for someone to listen. And maybe for the first time, you'll understand Wounded Knee was never a tragedy frozen in the past. It is the present, still living, still burning, still waiting to be heard. Because fire does not die, it changes shape. It hides in roots and blood and song. And one day, when the stars move again, when the earth exhales and the wind carries the rhythm across the plains, the circle will open once more. The dancers will return, the drums will rise, and the sky, the same sky that stood still that night, will finally begin to move again. The screen fades slowly to white. Snow falling, wind whispering through tall grass, then faintly, almost too faint to catch the sound, returns. A heartbeat, a drum, one last echo. The circle closes not in ending, but in continuation. You have just heard one voice in the long song of the earth, the narrator whispers. The fires of Wounded Knee did not vanish. They only went below, waiting for those who remember to listen again. And as the last sound fades, the camera lingers still endless cold over the frozen creek where the snow moves just slightly, as if something beneath it has begun to stir. The snow has fallen again over Wounded Plains, covering everything except the sound. They say when the wind stops, the earth still hums the names of the fallen. So tell me, do you think the dead truly rest? Or do they keep walking beneath our feet waiting to be remembered? Share what you believe, because maybe the circle was never meant to close. Welcome back, traveler. Tonight we go to the Dakotas, where the snow hides stories no textbook dares to tell. They say if you stand over the frozen plains long enough, you can still feel the ground breathing. Tell me, do you believe the land remembers the people it lost, or does it just pretend to forget? Drop your thoughts below and listen carefully. The earth might be listening too. The morning after that night was unlike any the plains had known. The horizon trembled under a cold so sharp it bit through cloth and skin alike. Frost spread like white fire across the ground, turning every blade of grass into glass. The air was still but heavy, as if the sky itself had forgotten how to move. A low mist clung to the valleys, wrapping itself around the tippies at Pine Ridge, swallowing the camp until it seemed to float in another world entirely. The Wounded Plains lay vast and silent, rolling in waves of white and gray, broken only by the trails carved by wagon wheels and the slow, deliberate footprints of soldiers and horses. To the east, the Black Hills shimmered faintly under the pale sun. To the west stretched nothing but distance, flat land, frozen streams, and the memory of 1,000 hoofbeats that would never return. It was December 1890, the last frontier, the last winter before everything changed. A young cavalry scout, Thomas Avery, wrote in his field log that morning, "We rode through a quiet that felt wrong. Even the crows did not cry. The Indian camps ahead looked deserted, but there was smoke, thin, slow, rising straight up as if the air refused to carry it away." He did not know that the Oglala called this silence by another name, the breath of the earth before morning. In the camps, the fires from the night before had burned low to ash. The elders sat together once more, not speaking, only watching the horizon through the fog. Red Feather, oldest among them, rubbed the ash between his fingers, feeling the grit, the warmth still clinging to it. He closed his eyes and whispered something in Lakota. The spirits did not leave. They are waiting for the wind. The people moved slowly, careful not to disturb what little peace remained. Women gathered the hides, stiff with frost, wrapping the smallest children, and humming soft songs to keep away the spirits that wandered between worlds. The men prepared the ponies, though none knew where they would ride. The snow was too deep, the cold too merciless, and yet the feeling was stronger than hunger or fear. They had to move. Somewhere. Anywhere but here. Above them, a pale sun rose through the haze, a white disk without warmth. It cast no shadow. It made the world look like something half remembered, half erased. The wind began to pick up again, carrying faint echoes, drums maybe, or thunder far away, but too rhythmic, too alive. The old women said it was the ancestors walking, returning from the ridge to see who still remembered their names. Out on the open plain, a single buffalo skull lay frozen into the earth. Its empty sockets faced east. Once millions had thundered across this land, now only bones and silence. To the Oglala, that skull was a warning and a promise both. It was said that when the last buffalo vanished, so too would the strength of the people. Yet Red Feather had always believed something different, that the spirit of the buffalo had merely gone beneath the ground, waiting for a time when the earth would breathe again. But for now, the earth was holding its breath. A group of soldiers appeared on the ridge at midday, black silhouettes against the white horizon. The sun caught on their rifles, turning the barrels to lines of cold fire. They did not ride fast. They did not shout. They simply watched. Below, the Oglala camp stirred uneasily. A mother pulled her son closer, whispering his grandfather's name for protection. Dogs barked, then fell silent. Inside one of the tepees, a young boy no more than 10 sat beside his grandmother. Her hair was white as snow, her hands cracked from age and winter. She told him a story, her voice low and steady, the same one she had told since he was small. It was about the ghost dance, the sacred movement that would bring back the buffalo, restore the dead, and wash the white man's world away. She said that if you danced long enough, if your heart was clean, the bullets would pass through you like smoke. The boy listened, eyes wide, unsure if he was hearing faith or fear. Outside, the snow began to fall again, not thick but steady, each flake catching the light like falling embers. The elders emerged from their meeting tent, slow and solemn. The decision had been made. They would not run. They would stay where they were until word came from Sitting Bull's people, though rumor said he had already been killed. The Great Spirit, they believed, had not finished speaking yet. Meanwhile, at the agency, Fort Captain James Forsyth received his orders from Washington: disarm them. Bring them in peacefully. He stared at the message for a long time, then folded it into his coat pocket and walked outside. The cold stung his eyes. He saw smoke rising from the distant Oglala camp, twisting upward like the tail of a wounded animal. Peacefully, he muttered. Always the same word. He knew better. The air itself carried tension, the kind that precedes a storm you can't see yet but can feel crawling along your skin. Night fell quickly. The temperature dropped to 20 below. Every breath turned to frost in the air. The Oglala lit their fires again, small circles of warmth scattered like stars across the plains. Each flame told a story. Each flame was a voice refusing to go silent. The elders sat in a ring, faces lit by the orange glow smoke rising from the pipes they passed hand to hand. Red Feather spoke softly, his voice trembling not from age but from the weight of memory. There was a time when the earth was full of songs, he said. The rivers sang, the trees sang, the fire sang. Then came the noise of iron, the sound that does not listen. And the songs fell quiet. But they are still here, under the snow, waiting. The youngest of the group, Black Blanket, looked toward the horizon, where faint lights blinked, campfires of the soldiers, perhaps. He clenched his hands. And when they come, he asked, do we fight? Red Feather stared into the fire. No, we remember. Outside the circle, a faint sound drifted on the wind, singing. Low, rising, falling. The ghost dance had begun again far across the ridge. Shadows moved in slow circles, arms lifted to the sky. The firelight flickered against their painted faces. Their garments of white cloth, their eyes closed as if already seeing the world reborn. The rhythm was hypnotic. Slow, relentless, the sound of faith refusing to die. The soldiers on the ridge saw the same lights, heard the same chanting. To them it sounded like rebellion. To the people dancing below it was prayer. Two worlds, one terrified of ghosts, the other speaking to them. By midnight, the snow had stopped. The stars returned sharp and cold. And once again they did not move. They hung suspended in the heavens as if trapped between seconds. The Oglala took it as a sign. The elders bowed their heads. Red Feather lifted a single coal from the fire with an old wooden stick and whispered to it, remember us. In the fort's barracks, Lieutenant Avery woke from a dream he couldn't shake. He wrote one line in his journal before dawn. The fires on the plains look like eyes, and I think they are watching us. Foti! The wind returned before sunrise, sweeping through the valleys like a living thing. Smoke curled over the camps, blending with the mist. And far to the east, the sound of horses began again. The wounded plains were awake. And for the first time in many generations, the earth itself seemed to be listening. They said it began with a whisper. Carried by the wind from the west, drifting through the canyons, echoing across the frozen grasslands like something half-remembered. By the time it reached Pine Ridge, it had already changed, part news, part rumor, part prophecy. Some called it the dance of salvation. Others called it madness. But to the Oglala, it was something far older than either word could hold. It was a call from the bones of the earth itself. The soldiers didn't understand what they were seeing. Not yet. The official reports described it clinically. Unusual gatherings observed among the Indians, nightly singing rhythmic movement, belief in supernatural protection. But what those men witnessed from the ridge lines was not a riot, it was resurrection. Hundreds of Lakota stood in circles, their feet bare against the snow. Arms outstretched to the heavens, they moved together as if pulled by some invisible current, a great living wheel of motion turning beneath the stars. Drums pounded like heartbeats of the land itself. Firelight flashed on faces painted white with sacred clay. Their voices rose in unison, low and trembling, chanting in a language that carried no translation, only feeling. For miles around, settlers said they could feel it through the ground, through the air, through the thin wooden walls of their homes. The rhythm seeped into dreams, into sleep. Cattle grew restless. Dogs howled until dawn. In the nearby fort, soldiers lay awake listening, pretending not to be afraid. They said the sky seemed to vibrate with the sound, and that sometimes between the drum beats there was silence so deep it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Wovoka's prophecy had reached them by then, the message carried by traders, by letters, by writers who swore they had seen the dead walking beside the living. He was a Paiute mystic from the Nevada desert, they said. A man who had died and returned. During a great eclipse, he had crossed into the land of spirits and been shown the world to come. The buffalo will return, the rivers will run pure again, the white man will vanish, the old ones will awaken. But only if the people danced 5 nights without rest, 5 circles under the sky until the world remembered itself. And so they danced. Through hunger, through snow, through the watchful eyes of the cavalry, they danced until their feet bled, until their bodies trembled, until they could no longer tell the difference between waking and dream. The missionaries called it delusion, but the Lakota said it was prayer. Every motion was meaning, every sound was memory. And in the dark between beats, something stirred that the soldiers could not name. A corporal from the 7th Cavalry wrote home to his wife, his words scrawled in pencil on damp paper. "We hear them every night. It's not like any hymn I've known. It starts soft, then grows until you feel it in your bones. The men say it's just superstition, but when the wind dies, I can still hear it like a heart that won't stop beating." At first, the officers laughed it off. Then they stopped laughing. The telegraph lines began to fail, no snow, no storm, just dead silence in the wires. Scouts returned with stories of lights burning across the plains where no camp should be. Some saw figures standing motionless in the distance, lines of men, women, and children, staring up at the frozen stars as if waiting for them to move. When soldiers approached, the figures faded like mist. In the camp itself, the Oglala elders gathered each night around the fire, their faces carved with shadow. Red Feather spoke rarely, but when he did, his voice carried like wind through bone. "The land has begun to speak again," he said. "It is remembering what we have forgotten." A woman beside him nodded, eyes closed. "And the sky listens," she whispered. "That is why it does not move." There were signs everywhere for those who cared to see them. Frost patterns forming in the shape of feathers on the tent walls, smoke that bent against the wind, children who dreamed of buffalo herds running under the snow, their hooves rumbling like thunder. Even the streams began to freeze in strange spirals, as though something unseen were turning beneath the surface. One night as the fire burned low, a boy ran into the circle of elders, breathless, terrified. He said he had seen his father dead 2 winters before, standing near the creek, wrapped in white, smiling. The old men rose and went to see. There were no footprints, but in the snow they found a single handprint pressed into the ice fingers, splayed wide, as if in blessing or warning. At Fort Robinson, Lieutenant Avery continued to record what he saw. His final entry before the massacre read simply, "They are not afraid. Not one of them. I watched them dance while the snow fell like ashes, and I swear the fire did not burn low. It glowed blue like the sky before a storm." The officers called it hysteria. The priests called it heresy, but the Lakota called it truth. They wore the ghost shirts, garments painted with suns and stars, the sacred eagle, the hand of life. The designs were not for decoration. They were protection, prophecy in color and pattern. Wovoka had told them, "The bullets of the white man will pass through you like mist." And when the soldiers saw those shirts, they saw rebellion. They saw defiance. They could not see faith. They could not see grief. The newspapers back east fanned the flames. "The Indian Messiah rises," they shouted. "Savages, prepare for war." But in the camps, the truth was quieter, gentler, infinitely more human. It was in the faces of mothers holding children close, singing to them in the flicker of the fires. It was in the old men who stared into the coals, whispering the names of those long gone. It was in the songs that carried into the night, blending prayer and mourning into something the outside world would never understand. As the weeks passed, the sky changed. The storms grew stranger, snow falling without wind. thunder rumbling from the frozen ground. Hunters reported hearing drums coming from beneath the ice, steady as a heartbeat. The rivers had begun to freeze from the inside out. It was as if the land itself had joined the song. And then, the first to disappear was a scout, sent out to count the dancers to measure the threat. He never came back. They found his horse a week later near Wounded Knee Creek, its reins frozen stiff, eyes wide open, as if it had seen something it could not comprehend. The man's tracks ended in the middle of the snow. No body, no struggle, just absence. The soldiers began to whisper among themselves. The priests prayed louder. The children in the camp said the spirits had taken him because he came without respect. And every night the fires burned on, each flame a heartbeat, each ember a memory refusing to die. Out beyond the camp across the ridges, faint lights moved again, lines of fire weaving through the mist. Some said they were soldiers marching by torchlight. Others said they were the ancestors walking back to join the living. The old women covered their faces, murmuring prayers. The young men gripped their rifles tighter, though they knew it would change nothing. By the last week of December, the snow had turned red in places from the clay, they said. From the earth bleeding, perhaps. Even the wind had grown strange, sometimes carrying laughter, sometimes voices that weren't there. One soldier wrote, "I looked at the plains and saw nothing moving, but I swear I could hear footsteps all around me." It was the calm before a storm no one could name, the slow tightening of a circle that had begun centuries before. In the Oglala camp, Red Feather stood once more before his people. The firelight flickered against his face, deepening the lines carved by time. "We are not waiting for war," he said. "We are waiting for truth. The land is watching, the sky is listening, and soon, very soon, both will speak." He turned his eyes upward. The stars still refused to move, and the night held its breath once more. The air began to change, almost imperceptibly at first, a thin metallic taste in the cold, a vibration in the wind that seemed to hum beneath the surface of things. Those who lived long on the plains could feel it the way animals do before a storm, that subtle pull in the bones, that trembling sense that something unseen was gathering strength. The soldiers at Pine Ridge wrote it off as nerves, fatigue, imagination, but the Oglala called it the breath before the break. Every day that winter felt like the edge of something too quiet, too still, too bright. The horizon looked endless yet heavy, as if it might collapse under the weight of what was coming. The snow gleamed unnaturally white, reflecting the sun in blinding shards. Riders appeared and vanished across the distant silhouettes moving through the mist, never close enough to identify. And always at night, the drums returned, echoing across the frozen hills like a heartbeat that refused to stop. At the agency fort, tension was a living thing. Young soldiers sharpened bayonets in silence. Officers paced the barracks, staring out at the emptiness. Their orders were simple: contain the ghost dance, disarm the tribes, restore order. But none of them could define what order meant anymore. Some whispered that the Lakota were planning war. Others swore they had seen their own patrolmen vanish into the fog. The reports became stranger. A cavalry detachment sent to the White Clay Creek never returned. When search parties went out, they found the horses first tied in a neat line, reins frozen stiff, eyes open. The men were gone. No tracks, no struggle, nothing but the faint smell of wood smoke in the air. On one saddle carved into the leather was a single word in Lakota: remember. That night, a blizzard swept across the plains, not wild, not chaotic, but slow, methodical, as though the storm itself had purpose. The wind howled through the cracks of every cabin, whistled through every rifle barrel. Snow built up against the windows like a wall. And over it all, faint but undeniable, came the rhythm of the drums, again deep, deliberate, steady. Some men said it was an echo, others said it was the heartbeat of the land beneath the ice. In the Oglala camp, the fires burned brighter than ever. The people danced. They danced through the snow, reached their knees. They danced through the wind, tore the breath from their lungs. They danced until their shadows merged with the firelight, until their footprints disappeared under the storm. The elders watched not in fear, not in defiance, but with the calm of those who have seen the circle turn too many times to pretend surprise. Red Feather stood with his staff buried in the snow. The firelight flickered against his face, turning his wrinkles into maps of another age. "They will come soon," he murmured. "And when they do, the sky will judge who remembers and who forgets." Further east at the fort, Captain Forsyth assembled his men. Snow clung to their coats, their rifles glinting in the moonlight. His orders were clear: surround the camp at Wounded Knee Creek, disarm them, and move them to the agency by dawn. No violence unless provoked. He read those words twice. The paper shook slightly in his hands. He knew, as all men there knew, that it would not end quietly. Back on the plains, the scouts returned with stories. They spoke of lights in the snow fires that burned blue, not orange. They said they had seen figures walking between the teepees taller than any man, their faces hidden their feet, leaving no mark. One man swore he saw a woman standing in the open field, her hair white as ash, her eyes glowing like the last embers of a dying fire. When he blinked, she was gone. But his horse refused to move forward. And still, the drums. They pulsed through the wind, through the trees, through the frozen soil. Every sound in the camp moved to their rhythm, the horses stamping the wind, sighing through the hide tents, the crack of burning wood. Even the soldiers felt it. One confessed later, "We tried to march, but the rhythm got into our steps." It was like the ground itself wanted us to move in time with them. The closer the army came, the more the land seemed to resist them. Wagons froze solid overnight. Rifle bolts jammed. Telegraph lines crackled with nonsense strings of dots and dashes that spelled no words but repeated one pattern again and again. Later, codebreakers would notice something chilling. The signal matched the rhythm of the ghost dance drums. In the settlements, fear became fever. The newspapers screamed of Indian rebellion. Towns fortified themselves with fences and rifles. Church bells rang at odd hours, not for service, but to drown out the sound of chanting carried by the wind. Families packed and fled east, leaving behind cabins still warm from their last fires. But those who stayed said the nights had changed. The sky felt closer. The stars seemed brighter, fixed, unblinking cold. And sometimes in the hour before dawn they could hear voices, not loud, not clear, but human, thousands of them whispering just beneath the wind. But to the Oglala, that was no mystery. The elders said the ancestors had risen, answering the dancer's call. The living and the dead were sharing the same breath once more, but to the soldiers it was nightmare. They were men trained for war, not for silence, not for ghosts, not for a world where the laws of heaven and earth blurred. On December 27th, the column moved out. 170 men on horseback. The 7th Cavalry. The same regiment that had once hunted Custer's killers and had sworn revenge. They rode through the frost-bitten dawn, the hooves of their horses muffled in snow. Ahead of them, the plains stretched white and empty. Behind them, the sound of the wind rising, falling like breath. Forsyth said nothing. He had the look of a man who already knew what waited for him at journey's end. At Wounded Knee Creek, the Oglala camp waited in the cold. The people had heard the hoofbeats hours before. The women had gathered the children, the men their rifles, the elders their prayers. No one spoke. Even the fires seemed to burn quieter, as though listening. Then, the horizon began to move. A dark line forming in the distance, the riders approaching. And in that moment, something strange happened. The wind stopped. Completely. The snow hung in the air suspended. Every sound fell away except one. The drums. Beating slow, then faster still, until it felt as if the whole earth was trembling beneath their rhythm. Men on horseback faltered. Horses reared. Someone shouted a warning. Someone else whispered a prayer. From the ridge above, Red Feather raised his hands toward the sky. His voice, though old, carried across the valley. "You hear them!" he cried. "They are coming for us, all the living and the dead." The soldiers leveled their rifles. The women began to sing. The wind came back screaming. The first shot did not come from anger. It came from fear. A rifle misfired, a horse bucked, and then chaos. Smoke, screams, snow turning red. But that is not where the story ends. Because long after the guns fell silent, long after the bodies were buried under frost, the drums kept beating faint, steady, eternal somewhere out on those same plains. They say if you stand there now when the night is still and the stars hang frozen in the sky, you can feel it through your boots, that low, ghostly rhythm pulsing up from the earth. The heartbeat of the wounded plains, the song that never stopped. The plains were never silent for long. They only pretended to be. Beneath the frost and the miles of snow, something always stirred whispers, through roots, tremors, through stone, the faint echo of hooves that had crossed these lands long before maps or flags. That winter 1890, the earth was restless again. The wind came howling from the north, carrying with it the scent of cedar smoke and fear. At Pine Ridge, the soldiers had begun to hear the sound. It came at night, faint but rhythmic, like the steady beating of a great drum, just below the surface of the world. The men joked at first it was the wind, they said, or the pounding of frozen trees, but the jokes didn't last. Because the sound never stopped. It followed them in their dreams, thumping behind their eyelids, pulling them awake with hearts racing. One private woke screaming, saying he had seen a circle of fire burning under the snow, men and women dancing without faces, their hands raised to a sky that did not move. In the Lakota camps, the fires multiplied. Each night, more people came, Oglala, Mini Konju, Hunk Papa, travelers from the far reservations drawn by the same call. They came on foot, on horseback, wrapped in hides and memory. Some carried small bundles of earth from the places where their ancestors had been buried. Others brought nothing but song. They called it the ghost dance, but to them it was not about ghosts. It was about return, about balance, about remembering the world before it was broken. The white soldiers saw the same sight and called it uprising. The traders called it madness, but for those who danced, it was prayer made visible. Each circle was a world unto itself. Drums thundered through the snow slow at first, then faster, until the beat no longer came from the hands of the drummers, but from the earth itself. The dancers moved in perfect rhythm. Arms raised, heads back, chanting words older than translation. Their ghost shirts painted with stars and suns gleamed faintly in the firelight, cloth stiff with frost. Eyes closed in faith that the world could be made whole again. From the ridge above, Captain Forsyth watched through his field glasses. "They've lost their senses," he muttered. But deep down he knew that what he was seeing wasn't insanity, it was devotion. Fierce, unyielding, unstoppable. The drums echoed for miles, pulsing across the plains like thunder trapped beneath the snow. Settlers heard it in their barns, their walls, their sleep. Dogs howled and hid. Horses kicked their stalls. One woman wrote in her diary, "It feels like the land itself has begun to breathe. The ground trembles when they sing." Then came the signs. The telegraph lines hummed at night, faint and eerie, tapping out messages that no one sent. The wind changed direction without warning. Frost patterns formed on the windows in the shape of feathers and circles. A wagon trail froze solid under clear skies. The horses found stiff, mid-step, eyes glazed. Breath still caught in the air. When soldiers went to investigate, they said the snow around the bodies had melted to mud as though the ground had swallowed heat. And there were disappearances. A patrol of 6 men vanished between Pine Ridge and White Clay Creek. The track showed them riding in perfect formation, then stopping suddenly in open ground. Horses gone, men gone. No sign of struggle, only a faint residue of ash scattered like dust in the snow. Their commanding officer wrote the sky was too quiet. Even the wind was afraid. For the Lakota, these were not mysteries. They were signs. Proof that the spirits were near, that the veil between the living and the dead had thinned to nothing. Red Feather spoke of it often sitting by the fires with the elders. "The world is trembling," he said. "The dead are not angry, they are awake." Children whispered of seeing figures in the fog, tall and wrapped in white, moving slowly through the camps. A young boy told his mother that a man with no eyes had spoken his name from the darkness and told him not to be afraid. The woman held her son and said, "It is good. The ancestors walk again." But in the forts, fear grew like rot. The 7th Cavalry had arrived, the same regiment that had been torn apart at Little Bighorn 14 years earlier. Many of them had come seeking redemption. Some came for revenge. Captain Forsyth set up camp on the edge of Wounded Knee Creek. He was a man bound by orders, but even he could sense something wrong in the air. The wind carried a smell he couldn't place, sweet, sharp, like blood and pine sap mixed together. He wrote in his notebook that night, "The land feels alive. The men speak of dreams. I do not sleep." Behind him, the soldiers sharpened bayonets and polished rifles. They were cold, hungry, and terrified. Some hid small crosses under their coats. Others prayed quietly, glancing toward the distant glow of the Oglala fires. They could see the silhouettes moving circles within circles, shapes that looked almost like flames themselves. The elders met again that night. Red Feather sat at the center, his breath rising in clouds as he spoke. "They watch us from the hills," he said. "They do not understand that what they see is not war. It is remembrance. It is what the earth asked of us." One of the younger warriors, restless, angry, asked, "And when they come, what then?" Red Feather smiled faintly. "Then the sky will speak for us." And it did. That night the aurora appeared, a curtain of light rippling across the heavens, green and gold and violet. It shimmered like the surface of water, bending and twisting but never moving forward. It hung there frozen. The people fell silent mid-dance, staring upward. Even the drums stopped. The light moved soundlessly across the stars, and for one long heartbeat time itself seemed to hesitate. At the fort, men ran outside to watch. Some crossed themselves. Some wept. A sergeant whispered, "I think God just turned his face." The next morning the snow fell red. Not crimson, but tinged faintly with color, like ash mixed with clay. The soldiers said it was dust from the hills. The Oglala said it was the blood of the old world seeping up from the ground. By afternoon the orders came, "Disarm the camp." The cavalry mounted up. The sound of hooves echoed through the valley, dull against the snow. Forsyth led them forward, his jaw-tight eyes fixed on the horizon. The men rode in silence, breath clouding around them like ghosts. They reached the ridge and stopped, looking down on the camp below, hundreds of teepees, smoke curling gently into the frozen air, children playing between them, unaware of what was coming. "The camp looks peaceful," one soldier muttered. Forsyth nodded. It always does before it happens. They rode down slowly. From the Oglala side, the watcher saw them coming. Red Feather stood leaning on his staff. "So it begins," he said softly. The circle closes. The air thickened as they approached, heavy and unreal. The horses' hooves sank deep into the snow, each step muffled. Men called to one another, but their voices came out dull, swallowed by the cold. Then without warning, the wind died. Every sound fell away. The world seemed to hold its breath. And in that silence, a single drumbeat echoed from the center of the camp. Boom! Then another. Boom! The sound rolled across the plain like thunder. Children froze, soldiers turned, horses reared. Then chaos. A rifle-discharged accident or fear no one ever knew. Screams, smoke, marmo. The soldiers fired wildly. The Lakota scattered, some reaching for weapons, others clutching their families. Women threw themselves over their children. The air filled with gunpowder and snow. Red Feather stood unmoving, arms spread as bullets tore through the air around him. "They cannot kill the song," he shouted. "They cannot kill the wind." When it was over, the snow was stained red. The valley lay quiet except for the groans of the dying and the crackle of fire. The 7th Cavalry buried their dead, then the Lakota. The reports would later call it a battle, but those who were there knew better. It was an ending. Yet even as the last fires died, the drums continued, faint, distant from somewhere beyond the ridge. The soldiers heard them too. A private swore he saw figures moving through the smoke. Men, women, children, glowing faintly, walking upright through the snow. The officer told him to forget it, but he didn't. He wrote one final note before leaving Dakota forever. "The land does not forget. I think it still breathes beneath the ice. I think it still remembers every name. And when the winter wind sweeps across Wounded Knee today, they say you can still hear it. The echo of the drums, the heartbeat of the world that would not die, the sound of the fire that refused to fade." The snow fell for 3 days after the gunfire stopped. Thick, endless, heavy, as if the sky itself wanted to cover what had been done. When it ended, the valley lay still. The creek was frozen over, smooth as glass, and beneath that glass the shapes of rifles and bodies blurred together, fragments of two worlds locked in one reflection. The soldiers called it peace, but peace out here had the color of ash. At Fort Robinson, the telegrams came in one after another. Engagement at Wounded Knee complete, hostiles neutralized, situation contained. Words printed in cold ink stripped of the screams that still echoed between the hills. The officers wrote as if describing a storm that had passed, not a people erased. Yet even in their calm reports, a strange unease bled through. One note read, "Burial delayed. Men report unusual noises at site, ground still warm." Days later, when the snow allowed them to return, the soldiers rode out again to bury the dead. They found the valley changed. The teepees were gone, burned or buried by the storm, but smoke still rose from the earth in thin, colorless threads. One soldier dismounted and pressed his hand to the ground. It was warm, faintly, impossibly warm. He stood quickly and refused to speak for the rest of the day. They dug a trench and called it a grave. They stacked the bodies side by side, covering them with whatever earth they could find. A chaplain read prayers while the wind howled, scattering the words before they could rise. When the last body was laid to rest, a corporal carved a cross from a branch and stuck it into the mound. "Let the land forget," he said. But the land did not forget. For weeks afterward, the storms came and went, and each time they passed, something changed. The wooden cross vanished. The grave mound flattened. The snow melted in strange circles, revealing bare soil beneath. One officer tasked with mapping the area noted that the circles formed patterns identical to the layout of the ghost dance camps. He showed it to his superiors. They told him to destroy the sketches. He didn't. In his journal, discovered years later, he wrote, "I believe they're still here. The earth refuses to take them. The wind speaks their names at night." The survivors who returned to the site months later found it eerily untouched. No birds, no tracks, no sound except the soft creak of the frozen creek. A woman named Elk Woman, whose sister had died there, described it simply, "The land hums. You can feel it in your feet." She brought her children to stand beside her and told them, "Listen, that is how we remember." Not long after, strange reports began to spread through the forts and towns. Ranchers spoke of seeing lights on the horizon, not campfires, not torches, but small glowing orbs drifting low over the valley, pulsing gently like breathing. Soldiers patrolling the region refused to go near them. A young private who did was found the next morning alive but shaking, unable to speak. When he finally did, his only words were, they were singing without mouths. Folklore began to weave itself into the facts, as it always does when truth alone cannot carry the weight. Some said the spirits of the ghost dancers had taken up residence beneath the ice, still moving in slow, eternal rhythm. Others claimed to have heard hooves at night, a sound like buffalo stampeding through snow, though no tracks were ever found. Then came the first thaw. When spring reached Dakota, the snow melted everywhere but Wounded Knee. The rivers ran wild with meltwater flooding the lowlands, but the creek at the valley stayed frozen. Reporters called it an anomaly. The locals called it a sign. The ice shimmered in colors pale blue, faint red, as though lit from below. And one night in early March, it cracked. The sound rolled across the plains like thunder, waking every settler from Pine Ridge to White Clay. When they looked outside, they saw light, faint golden rising from the valley floor, twisting upward like smoke. The next day, the ice was gone, the creek flowed free, and yet the air around it remained unnaturally warm. When the soldiers returned to investigate, they found the burial trench collapsed inward. The earth had split down the middle, exposing dark, damp soil underneath, but no bodies, not one. The only thing left was a drum. It sat perfectly upright at the center of the hollow, untouched by decay. Its hide was cracked but intact, and when the wind blew across it, the skin vibrated softly, rhythmically like a heartbeat. The officer in charge ordered it destroyed, but when one of the men struck it with his rifle butt, the wood splintered and bled sap the color of rust. The man dropped the weapon and vomited. He would die of fever within a week. After that, no one touched the drum again. They buried it deeper and left the site, but the sound did not stop. That summer, settlers reported hearing drums in the night, always distant, always the same beat. Missionaries at Pine Ridge said the wind carried voices, words in Lakota, repeated endlessly, "We are still dancing." One missionary, Father Doyle, stayed longer than the rest. He was a man of reason, trained in science as well as scripture. He recorded the noises, measured temperature changes, cataloged the strange lights that hovered above the valley at dusk. In his final letter, dated September 3, 1891, he wrote, "I no longer doubt what they say. The drums come from below. The land itself hums. When I pray, the sound matches my heartbeat. Perhaps it always has. Perhaps it always meba." The letter was never delivered. His body was found near the creek 2 weeks later, eyes open, face peaceful. Around him, the snow had melted in a perfect circle, and still the folklore grew. By the turn of the century, travelers spoke of ghost fires burning at the edge of the plains. Flames that produced no heat dancing along the hills like memory made visible. Hunters swore they saw entire herds of bison moving through fog at dawn only to fade when the light touched them. In 1910, a group of surveyors from the Army Corps of Engineers reported equipment malfunctions while mapping near Wounded Knee. Their compasses spun wildly, their thermometers dropped 20 degrees in seconds. They left before finishing their work. The report was filed, then classified. And through it all, the Lakota kept returning not for vengeance, not for answers, but for remembrance. They brought tobacco, sage cedar. They sang the songs of the ghost dance in low voices, not to summon but to soothe. "The earth remembers what it buries," one elder told a journalist. "We are here, so it will remember gently." Some nights when the wind was low and the stars stood still, visitors said they could see movement in the distance. Faint figures circling in the dark, their steps slow and steady, keeping perfect rhythm with a sound that was not there, and if they stayed long enough, they began to feel it too. The vibration in the ground, the pulse beneath the frost, the echo of drums buried in the bones of the earth. 100 years later, the valley still hums. Scientists have measured low-frequency resonance below Wounded Knee Creek, unexplained rhythmic constant. The reports read like history repeating itself. And yet, the Lakota never asked for proof. They said proof was for those who doubted. For them, faith was enough, because the fires that burned in 1890 did not die. They simply went underground, carried by the land, the wind, the memory of those who refused to be forgotten. And every December, when the snow falls and the stars freeze over the Dakotas, the plains come alive again. You can stand on that ridge, close your eyes, and if the night is silent enough, you'll hear it. The drums, the heartbeat, the fire still burning beneath the cold. The circle unbroken, the story unfinished. The earth never truly closed over Wounded Knee. It only pretended to. Every year the snow came and covered the valley like a shroud. Every spring it melted everywhere except there. The soldiers left, the agents moved on, the newspapers forgot. But the land did not. The land remembers everything, especially the things men try hardest to forget. The official report said the dead were buried in one trench marked by a single wooden cross. But when surveyors returned years later, the ground had shifted. The markers were gone. In their place were dozens of shallow depressions, circular, almost geometric, as though the earth itself had rearranged the graves into a pattern. An old interpreter from Pine Ridge said softly, "The circle again. They are still dancing beneath." And maybe they were. In 1893, a government photographer named Benjamin Wilcox arrived at Wounded Knee with a heavy plate camera. He had been hired to capture a site of historical interest, but when his images developed, something strange appeared. The photographs were clear, almost too clear, but in three of them, faint white shapes hung in the background just above the snow. They weren't smoke. They weren't clouds. When magnified, they looked like people figures in motion, blurred but unmistakably human, forming a ring. He destroyed the negatives that night, but one copy survived locked in an archive until 1932 when it was rediscovered and quietly reclassified as optical error. Yet the pattern continued, the rumors grew. Local settlers whispered that their livestock would not cross the valley. Horses froze, trembling, refusing to move. Dogs howled through the night, their cries echoing like sirens in the empty distance. At dawn, people woke to find strange prints in the frost handprints, arranged in spirals, pressed deep into the ice and melting slower than the rest. Those who lived nearby began to speak of the breathing ground. They said if you stood still long enough, the soil beneath your feet would pulse, slow, rhythmic, steady, like the heart of something alive and vast beneath the snow. One winter, a telegraph operator stationed near Pine Ridge began hearing tapping sounds on his line at night. At first, he thought it was interference from weather, but the rhythm was too deliberate. He copied the sequence of dots and dashes into his logbook. When translated, it read, "We still dance." He burned the log, resigned his post, and left Dakota forever. In the Lakota camps, the stories grew more specific, more alive. Children were told that the spirits of Wounded Knee gathered in the storm clouds each December, that they traveled with the snow, whispering through the blizzards to remind the living that the fire never died. The elders said the sky above the valley would sometimes freeze, no stars moving, no clouds drifting, while below the wind would swirl in perfect circles as if pulled by unseen hands. And then there were the dreams. People from across the reservations began reporting the same vision, a great plain endless and white, with fires burning beneath the surface. From below the ice, thousands of hands reached upward, not in fear, but in offering. Above them, the aurora shimmered in the shape of a great circle. A young girl from Rosebud told her mother she had seen Red Feather standing in the light, his staff raised. He told me, she said, the world will sing again when men remember how to listen. The federal agents called it hysteria. The priests called it possession. But neither could explain what happened next. In 1899, lightning struck the burial site during a dry storm. There was no rain, only a single flash that split the night and struck the ground with blinding fire. When the residents of Pine Ridge arrived the next morning, they found the valley burned, the snow gone, the soil charred black, the air still hot. At the center of the blast stood a tree dead before, but now split open, its trunk hollow and filled with light pulsing faintly like a lantern. The Lakota said it was a message. The fire beneath has touched the sky. It wasn't the last sign. In 1902, a U.S. geological team conducted a study on unexplained seismic patterns around Wounded Knee. Their instruments recorded low repeating tremors deep underground, perfectly regular every 9 seconds. When amplified, the frequency resembled a drumbeat. The report was labeled classified, anomalous data, and buried in archives for nearly half a century. But the people did not need science to tell them what they already knew. They said the dancers below the snow had become one with the land. Their steps had turned into the heartbeat of the plains, their voices into the wind, their fire into the pulse of the earth. That was why nothing grew there the same way, why the grass bent always toward the east, why birds never nested near the creek. In 1915, a writer from Boston visited Pine Ridge to document the superstitions of the plains. He spoke with an old woman who had been a child during the ghost dance. Her name was Weeyaka Wee Featherwoman. She was nearly blind but still sang as she spoke. "We danced because the world was ending," she said. But it didn't end. It only changed its face. We thought the soldiers stopped the song, but they didn't. They only made it deeper. Now the earth sings it instead. When he asked if she still heard it, she smiled. "Every winter," she said, "when the wind stops, you can hear the ground breathe." The writer laughed then, politely uneasily, and left. He died 2 years later, in his sleep pen still in his hand. His last note read, "I heard the drums again tonight. I was not in Dakota." By the 1920s, even the outsiders began to notice. Airmen flying over the Dakotas at night reported flickering lights along the ridges near Wounded Knee, moving, dancing, weaving into circles, then vanishing when approached. One pilot in his flight log wrote that his compass spun wildly as he passed over the valley, his altimeter freezing for 10 full seconds. "The stars disappeared below me," he wrote, "and for a moment I thought the sky had stopped breathing." Decades later, during World War II, an officer stationed in South Dakota requested permission to build an airfield near Pine Ridge. The Army approved. The engineers began surveying the area, but their machines kept failing. Compass needles turned east no matter their direction. Electrical instruments drained overnight. Radio operators reported faint voices in their headsets whispering rhythmic syllables that no one could identify. One of them recorded the transmission. It lasted 8 minutes. When played back, the sound was unmistakable, the beat of a drum, distant and layered, fading in and out like a heartbeat beneath the wind. In 1948, the Air Corps sealed the site. Their internal memo read simply, "Interference of unknown origin. Project discontinued." But the Oglala never called it interference. They called it persistence. They said the land was reminding them, we are still here. Even now, over a century later, people still come. Tourists, historians, wanderers. Some leave flowers, some leave tobacco, some leave nothing but silence. A few never leave at all. In 1989, a hiker from Rapid City vanished near the creek. His tent and gear were found intact, fire still smoldering. His footprints circled the site twice, then stopped abruptly. No signs of struggle, no body. Local police wrote it off as exposure. The Oglala said, the land took him to listen. Because that's what Wounded Knee became, not a graveyard, but a living thing. A reminder that some stories are too large to stay buried. That history, when silenced, becomes an echo, and that echo eventually finds a way to speak again. At Pine Ridge today, the elders still gather each December. They light small fires and face the east. They tell the children not to be afraid when the night grows still and the wind falls silent, because that is when the world listens. That is when the ancestors walk. One elder, a descendant of Red Feather, once said, "The soldiers wrote their reports, the government wrote its laws, but the land wrote its own truth, and it never used ink. It used rhythm, it used breath." And if you go there, if you stand among the dry grass at sunset when the horizon turns to glass and the last light fades, you'll feel it too. The air thickens, the wind slows, the ground hums beneath your boots. Then faintly from nowhere and everywhere at once comes the sound. A heartbeat. A drum. A song without end. It rises through your bones slow and steady until you cannot tell where your pulse ends and the plains begin. That is the secret of Wounded Knee. The fire did not fade. It moved beneath the skin of the world and waits still for someone brave enough to listen. For decades, the world tried to move on. The headlines changed, the borders changed, the names of nations rose and fell like tides, but the valley remained the same. Wind over the grass, snow in the ravines, silence that felt heavier than air. Yet beneath that silence something endured. A pulse, a memory, a hum in the ground that refused to fade. By the mid-20th century, the story of Wounded Knee had become history, a line in a textbook, a paragraph between wars. But history is not the same as truth. Truth lingers in bones and earth, in the quiet places that governments forget to pave over. In the summer of 1948, a team of geologists from the U.S. Army Signal Corps was sent to the Dakotas to study what they called magnetic anomalies. They brought with them portable seismographs, radio wave receivers, and newly developed resonance meters. Their goal was simple: map underground vibrations caused by shifting permafrost. But what they found at Wounded Knee wasn't ice. Their instruments registered rhythmic pulses, slow, deliberate repeating at precise intervals, 80 beats per minute, human heartbeat tempo. At first they assumed mechanical interference until they cut the power. The pulse continued. The team stayed one night in the valley against local advice. Around 2 a.m., one of the receivers activated on its own, broadcasting faint audio through static. When the sound engineer increased the gain, the tent filled with a low, steady thump like a drum struck far away. Underneath it, a voice, unintelligible, layered, almost human, speaking in a cadence the interpreter later said resembled Lakota prayer. The next morning, half the team demanded to leave. The report was filed, stamped, classified geological anomaly, and buried in archives for 30 years. But it didn't stay buried. In the 1960s, a young ethnomusicologist named Thomas Keene from the University of Chicago began collecting recordings of native ceremonial songs. He traveled across the plains, visiting reservations, gathering oral histories. When he reached Pine Ridge, the elders warned him, "You may record the wind, but it will record you back." He laughed until his first night near Wounded Knee. He left the microphone running outside his tent. The tape played back 12 hours of silence. And then, without warning, a pattern emerged, faint at first like distant thunder, then clearer, a drumbeat, slow, measuring time itself, then layered over it a woman's voice, old, gentle, singing words that no one in the camp recognized. Keene brought the recording to the university. Linguists confirmed the voice was speaking in an archaic form of Lakota, older than the 19th century, with inflections no longer used even in oral tradition. Her words translated to, "The fire sleeps, but it breathes still. When the stars freeze, we return." The recording was never released. Keene disappeared 2 years later while conducting fieldwork in Nebraska. His tent was found folded, his car intact. The reel-to-reel tapes inside had melted as if burned from the inside out. In the 1970s, the American Indian movement returned to Pine Ridge. They came not with rifles, but with resolve to reclaim what had been taken, to tell the stories that had been buried under treaties and silence. During the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973, something happened that even the veterans could not explain. Journalists present that winter described nights of eerie calm, no wind, no snow falling, just air, so still it rang in the ears. Then sometime after midnight they heard it drums. Not near, not far, everywhere. They moved through the air like thunder without direction, rolling, rising, fading, returning. Some reporters thought the protesters were performing rituals, but the Oglala said no one was drumming that night. When the recordings from the news crews were reviewed later, the sound was there, clear, steady, impossible to pinpoint. Engineers said it was frequency interference. The Lakota said it was the ancestors keeping watch. One elder, Joseph Black Elk, told a reporter, "They think this is protest, but it is ceremony. Every time they bring guns here, the land remembers the first blood. It wakes up. It beats again." And it did. Throughout the late 20th century, strange phenomena continued to ripple outward from the valley. Pilots reported sudden radio static while flying over the site. Researchers experienced compass failure. Campers claimed to see columns of light rising from the snow, white and blue, moving upward like spirits ascending. Scientists dismissed it as ionization from geological activity. But geologists found no fault lines, no magnetic rock, no reason for the readings. Then came the discovery of the Wounded Knee cylinder. In 1982, during the renovation of an old military storage building near Fort Meade, workers uncovered a box of phonograph cylinders dated 1891 marked "Property of the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs." Most were blank, but one, when played, carried sound, faint, crackling, ghost-like. A man's voice spoke in English. "They are singing again. I am afraid the ground will not keep them." Then, after a pause, a drum began to play, low and endless, before the recording cut off. No explanation was ever offered. The cylinder vanished from archives soon after its discovery. By the 1990s, modern technology began to catch up with the myths. A team from South Dakota State University placed seismic sensors in the valley to monitor micro-vibrations. They detected rhythmic pulses recurring every winter between December 27th and January 3rd, the same dates as the massacre. The pattern repeated exactly every 9 seconds across multiple instruments for 7 nights straight. They published their findings, avoiding words like music or heartbeat. But one researcher, speaking anonymously, told a journalist, "When I listened to the raw audio, it sounded alive, like someone breathing beneath the ground." Meanwhile, the descendants of the Oglala elders returned each year to hold quiet ceremonies at the site. They did not speak to tourists. They lit fires of sweetgrass and sage. They sang old songs with no drums because the land already had one. They said the ancestors danced beneath their feet, keeping the world in rhythm, balancing the living and the dead. In 2005, an audio team from the BBC came to record ambient sounds for a documentary. At 2 a.m., their microphones picked up an ultra-low frequency vibration too deep for human hearing. When the data was visualized in a spectrogram, the waveform formed a perfect circle. They showed it to the Lakota interpreter who traveled with them. He smiled and said softly, "That is how we draw the world. The circle of life, the circle of death, the circle that never ends." Then in 2010, something even stranger happened. A satellite thermal scan of the Pine Ridge Reservation showed an anomaly, a large area of ground emitting heat far higher than its surroundings right over Wounded Knee Creek. The temperature difference was nearly 12 degrees Celsius. When the same scan was repeated in summer, the anomaly was gone. Only winter awakened it. Scientists speculated geothermal activity, though the Black Hills are not volcanic. The elders said it was the fire waking beneath the snow. Today, they still come descendants of those who fell, students, historians, wanderers. They walk through the valley in silence, feeling the weight in the air. Sometimes they leave offerings, tobacco feathers, bits of red cloth. Sometimes they stay until the wind stops. And when it does, the drums return. They rise through the earth like breath through stone, slow, deliberate human. Some cry, some fall to their knees, some simply stand there, unable to move. In that moment, the past and the present collapse into one. The fire of 1890 meets the world that forgot it. The circle completes for an instant before the wind stirs again and the snow covers the tracks. And somewhere across the endless plain, a voice whispers through the frost. The song was never ours to end. The camera would pull back here, wide, silent, vast, showing the ridges, the creek, the empty valley glowing faintly beneath a sky that has not moved in centuries. And the voiceover, low and steady, would say, "The dead are not gone. They are simply waiting for us to listen." They say winter never truly leaves the wounded plains. It only hides for a while, beneath the grass, beneath the silence, beneath the illusion that the world has moved on. But if you stand long enough under that motionless sky, if you listen the way the old ones did, you'll hear it. The slow, hollow breathing of the earth, the memory of what it once saw. For more than a century, history has tried to bury that night, turning the massacre into dates, names, numbers. The textbooks call it an engagement, the archives call it a tragedy, and the politicians call it a regrettable chapter. But the land calls it something else entirely. It calls it unfinished. Every year since 1890 without fail, strange things have happened here. At first they were small, the wind pausing mid-breath, the snow forming perfect circles, the sound of drums rolling through valleys with no people for miles. The government sent geologists, the churches sent priests. The scientists brought instruments, none stayed long. They said the readings were inconclusive, but their eyes told another story. In the 1920s, a meteorological team stationed in Pine Ridge recorded what they thought were atmospheric vibrations during a calm December night. The barometers ticked rhythmically. Their instruments shook ever so slightly every 8 seconds, steady as a pulse. They assumed it was wind trapped between ridges. But there was no wind that night. The logbook entry still preserved in the National Archives ends mid-sentence sound persists. Not wind, resembles. The ink trails off there as if the writer had simply stopped. By 1940, the valley had become legend, a place of uneasy fascination. Airmen flying over at night said their compasses spun out of control. Their engines stuttered for no reason. Some claimed to see flickers of blue fire in the snow, small as candle flames lining the creek like a road made of ghosts. None stayed long enough to find out where it led. In the 1950s, surveyors testing soil for radio towers described electrical distortion localized entirely within the Wounded Knee Basin. When they played back their field recordings, they heard what they thought was static until someone slowed the tape. Beneath the noise was rhythm, drum beats, measured, intentional, human. But the Lakota didn't need machines to tell them that. They already knew. Every December 29th, they returned not for spectacle, not for grief, but for communion. The descendants of Red Feather and Black Elk, of Elk Woman and Whitebird gather before dawn on the ridges, lighting small fires of sage and cedar. They do not weep. They do not wail. They sit in silence, waiting for the land to speak first. And always it does. At first it's subtle, almost nothing. A vibration beneath the soles of their feet, a ripple through the frozen ground. Then the sound builds deep, low, unmistakable. A drumbeat. Slow, ancient. The same rhythm their ancestors danced to, the same rhythm the rifles tried to erase. It comes from the soil, from the water, from the air itself, as if the entire plain were breathing again. No one ever says a word. The children press their palms to the earth. The elders close their eyes. They call this moment the returning. A few outsiders have witnessed it, journalists, photographers, researchers, and most never speak of it again. In 1973, during the American Indian Movement occupation, television crews stationed at Pine Ridge recorded footage that night. The cameras caught flickering lights over the valley, dozens of them swaying gently in the darkness, moving in circles. The footage was aired once, then pulled from broadcast. The network claimed the film was damaged by exposure, but technicians who saw the original reels insisted it was clear, too clear. The lights weren't reflections. They were shapes. Omen. Dancing. The occupation ended. The lights never did. Decades passed. The world changed. Satellites mapped every inch of the Earth. But when they turned their lenses to Wounded Knee, the images came back blurred, overexposed, distorted as if the ground refused to be captured. One NASA researcher reportedly said, "It's the only place where the infrared refuses to cool." Even today, that remains true. Thermal scans show the soil there glowing faintly warmer than the surrounding prairie, 5, sometimes 10 degrees higher. No geothermal vents, no scientific reason. Just heat pulsing gently beneath the snow as though the fire of 1890 still burns below. Some say it's geological, the Lakota say it's spiritual, maybe they're the same thing. In 2019, a team of audio engineers returned to record ambient wind for a documentary. Their microphones captured what they thought was low-frequency resonance, too deep for human ears but visible on the spectrogram as a perfect wave. When the sound was sped up 400 times, it formed a distinct pattern, the rhythm of a heart. 80 beats per minute, exactly human. When they showed the data to a tribal historian, she only nodded. "It's not the land that remembers us," she said. "It's us who forgot how to hear the land." Because to the Oglala Wounded Knee was never a place of death, it was a crossing. A bridge between worlds where the circle thinned and the ancestors stepped through. When the soldiers fired their guns, the people fell, but the circle did not. It went underground into the soil, into the rhythm of everything that came after.